All right, Nico, can you say, welcome to another episode of Healthy Births, Happy Babies?
It's a happy episode. Happy babies.
Welcome back to another episode of Healthy Births, Happy Babies. I'm Dr. Jay Warren. I'm the prenatal and pediatric chiropractor here at the Capuana Center. And this podcast is all about helping you have a proactively healthy pregnancy so you can have a safe, gentle, natural birth. And that's going to allow you to bring your baby into the world that much more gently and healthily so you can start off your family experience more powerfully than if it's full of stress and trauma and other health concerns. So if you are a fan of this show and you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. Wherever you listen to your podcast, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss an upcoming episode. And also, if you haven't rated or reviewed the podcast and you've enjoyed it and gotten value of it, that will really help me out because that'll allow this podcast to reach more and more parents like yourself that might be missing out on this type of information and helping them along their parenting journey. So thank you in advance for that. And thank you if you already have rated and reviewed. So on today's episode, we have Dr. Catherine Monk joining us. I've gotten to know her work through my studies with APA, the Association of Pre- and Perinatal Psychology and Health, but I also saw her in the movie In-Utero, is the documentary that I had the movie maker on the podcast earlier, Catherine Gyllenhaal. It's a great movie about the effect of stress on the pregnancy as well as on the baby's development later on down the line. And she was one of the experts featured there. And I'm having her on the podcast today to dive deeper into that subject about how stress and depression and anxiety can put the baby at risk for further developmental issues later on. And even more importantly, what you can do about that to lower those risks and to work with it. So let me read her bio to you, introduce her to you, and then we'll be able to switch over to my conversation with her. Dr. Catherine Monk is a professor in the Departments of Psychiatry and Obstetrics and Gynecology, as well as a director of research at the Women's Program at Columbia University Medical Center. She's also a research scientist at the New York State Psychiatric Institute. She's a two-time recipient of the prestigious Brain and Behavior Research Foundation Young Investigator Award, and her research has been continuously funded by the National Institutes of Mental Health since 2001. Dr. Monk's research brings together the fields of perinatal psychology, developmental psychobiology, and neuroscience to focus on the earliest influences on children's developmental trajectories, those that happen in utero, and how to intervene early to prevent risk for mental health disorders in the future children. So with that, let me switch over to my conversation with Dr. Monk. All right, Dr. Monk, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, I'm excited to talk with you about your research that you're doing in this field. I mean, in your bio, it's just you're very involved in pre- and perinatal research and stress effects on not just the mom but the baby. And it was actually your work that I was first exposed to it through the APA program and Kate White, and then Catherine Gyllenhaal, the maker of the In-Utero movie, was on and spoke very highly of your work. And so I'm just really happy to have a researcher here to kind of explain a little bit more about these somewhat complicated topics. But as I said, with the bio, we had explained, or our listeners had heard a lot about you. But tell us first, like as a researcher, how did you get interested in the first place around prenatal research and perinatal research?
Sure. I would like to add that I'm also a clinician. I was originally trained as a clinical psychologist, and I do still see patients. And that really is much of the roots of the research that I do, in that the program where I trained, the graduate school program, had a huge focus on development as, understanding people's development as a way to help them in their current lives as either older children or adults or very old adults. So that developmental perspective, and really we should have a footnote here and say that for all of the criticism of Freud, and of course much of it is, as often is the case with original thinkers, is now criticized or been debunked, he thought developmentally about how people are who they are. And I really think we should give him credit there. And to just really expand the scope for a minute, I primarily am focused on factors such as stress and depression prenatally in the woman that may affect the child's future development through that child's exposure in utero. And then my outcome of interest is primarily what we call neurobehavioral development. And that encompasses, say, having mental health problems or behavioral problems. But really to expand the scope, it's important that we all have this developmental perspective, I think, in thinking about our health in general. And, whether we're struggling with bad eating habits as we're older, or, being overweight or significantly overweight, I should say, or associated factors, poor health factors such as high cholesterol or carrying a lot of adiposity, or we say a lot of fat, or if it's, depression or not managing stress well. These outcomes are in part products of the lives we've lived, how we've been parented, the context in which we grew up. And really importantly, all of these factors get embedded in our biology. So whether it's our stress regulation or our neurons firing in our brain and what synapses get made in our brain. So we all are the products, in my view and many other people's views, we all are the products of the lives we've lived. And so it's a developmental perspective on health in general. So to go back to your original question, I came into this research work with having this developmental perspective when I sit with adult patients. And primarily now my adult patients are pregnant women, women postpartum when they can't conceive, women who've had a pregnancy loss, etc. And so I came to this work with a developmental perspective, and I was also trained to see children and to treat them. And again, you can see the developmental focus. And I had the very naive view, and this was beginning to percolate for others at the time, but I had this naive view that pushing development back earlier might make it more simple, because understanding the developmental factors and how we become who we become is immensely complex. And people were starting to talk about what is known as the developmental origins of health and disease. And in that work, and it's David Barker, one of the leaders in this work, was including the prenatal experience at the time of development in our adult health outcomes. And so I thought going to the prenatal period might simplify things, and I'm chuckling because in fact it's just the opposite. It's become also proven to be immensely complex.
Mm-hmm. And was it something that your clinical work then led you more into wanting to dive deeper and do research, or were you training-wise doing both?
It clinically became clear to me that working with pregnant women and their partners, or women postpartum, or women with very young babies and their partners, was an amazing time to do intervention work. And so by doing so, there's more than one patient. There's the woman, and then there's also her developing and future child. So again, you hear the developmental perspective and this sense that it really is an optimal time. You can leverage this period, pregnancy and postpartum, that transition to parenting, even if it's a second or third child. Research indicates there is immense investment in behavioral change, optimizing one's health. There's just a paper that came out showing that it's a time when women are very, very motivated and successful at quitting smoking, for example, is when they're pregnant. And we all struggle with behavioral and what we call mental changes in our lives, how to manage stress better, et cetera. So this is a time of motivation for change, for optimizing one's health. It's also a time when women and their partners, but I really do focus on the women, are reflecting on their own childhoods, both explicitly and implicitly, and thinking about how they want to parent, even better than they were parented, or perhaps really move away from some bad parenting. And so it's a coming together of motivation and opportunity where you do have more than one patient to make change.
And a lot of the research you've done is around like the effects of stress during pregnancy and its effect on the baby. And now we can understand now that there's effects physically on the baby as far as their physical development and their neurological development, and then also as far as what that might carry through later on, which you're talking about as far as interventions. As far as depression and stress, like how does that affect the baby and what you've found in your research, around, like physically and neurodevelopmentally?
So in our work, we've wanted to showing that stress and depression and anxiety are associated with risks for behavioral or mental health problems for the child later in life, particularly attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, greater risk for depression as a teenager, particularly in girls. And we've set in a time point that we can see, or we can show evidence for the maternal mood effects during pregnancy affecting the child proximal, close to when the effects are happening. So that is in the fetus, in the newborn, and even in some of our more recent work in differences in the placenta. And we wanted to show these effects, and continue to want to do so, frankly, right around the pregnancy period, because that helps us, frankly, be convinced about this model. And if we see the effects, we can feel even more confident about our data showing maternal anxiety in pregnancy is associated with risk for ADHD at 6 and 7 years old. When we see those effects 6 and 7 years later, we do always have to wonder, and this is true of any research study, you always have to sort of play devil's advocate with yourself and say, well, what's another interpretation? And so when you see these effects in 6 and 7 year olds, you do wonder, well, did the anxiety in pregnancy foreshadow some factors in that child's postnatal development over those 6 and 7 years? And that's actually the agent of change, the agent that is having this negative impact on the child's development. So we'll see if we could add to the story and see the effects of maternal mood and maternal depression and stress and anxiety on the fetus, on the placenta, on the newborn brain, close to when they're happening. So we've done several studies showing that fetuses have different reactivity. They're more reactive if their mother has significant stress or depression and anxiety during pregnancy. We just did a study, of course these are all with colleagues, where we showed that newborns whose mothers had untreated depression during pregnancy compared to women who were did not have depression, they were healthy controls, they had a different resting state connectivity in their brain, in part which involves the amygdala, and we know the amygdala is a key player in emotion regulation. So even at birth, these babies' brains were different based on their mother's depression during pregnancy.
And there was I don't know if it's the same study, but you were linking maternal depression with increased birth weight and also heart rate variability.
Yes. That was a really interesting study led by a colleague of mine, Lisa Eklund-Flores. And in this careful work she did, putting together some different data sets, she was able to show that depression was associated with a heavier weight at birth. And that was important, and as you indicate, she began to get at some of the mechanisms in terms of autonomic nervous system regulation in the mothers. And it was contrary to other data that has showed lower birth weight. And so again, the carefulness of research is so important. And this higher birth weight is relevant in terms of As we all know, we have really an obesity epidemic in this study, and there are associations between heavier birth weight and being at risk for having difficulties with weight management in the future.
And as far as heart rate variability, could you explain that, of like what that factor, whether it's where you have lower heart rate variability or higher, and which one's better and the like, and how does that relate to stress?
Right. That is a little bit of a complicated variable, so it does need to be discussed in context. But generally, having higher heart rate variability is associated with better physical health and also with better ability to regulate one's emotions. So often the saying is the heart is happiest when it dances. So this is little changes in a heart rate is what heart rate variability is measuring, and particularly the vagus nerve that sits on the heart and can very efficiently control the heart rate going up or down by either putting the brake on or releasing the brake when we need to have higher heart rate to pump more blood through our system to run away from the bear in the woods. And so generally higher heart rate variability, that dancing heart that can be very nimble, is associated with better health, as I just indicated, both mentally and physically. And in terms of, if we can take it to the fetus for a minute, we've shown something that I think at first will seem paradoxical, but does fit into where a lot of research in the area in which I work, this Developmental Origins of Health and Disease, is going. And that is, we've seen that when fetuses are actually exposed to indices of stress, such as higher stress hormone cortisol in pregnant women, they actually have greater heart rate variability. And that, again, may seem paradoxical, and in some ways it is, except that in the Developmental Origins of Health and Disease research, many of us are finding that exposure to greater challenge than is species typical, so greater stress a woman is experiencing during pregnancy or depression, is associated with an accelerated development for the baby in utero. And other people have seen this as the baby is older. And the thinking is that from an evolutionary perspective, and Vivek Glover has been really an originator in connecting these dots, from an evolutionary perspective, why does nature allow a pregnant woman to communicate her experiences to her fetus? And the fetus is indeed protected in many, many ways, but why is there this communication, as we're beginning to discover? And some of the thinking is that it is to help prepare the fetus, the future baby, for the world to come. And if the woman is living in a time of immense threat and challenge and is feeling stressed, there's a mechanism by which she can communicate to the baby that it's a dangerous world out there, be prepared, is probably going to be good for the survival of that species. So a baby developing and getting ready more rapidly for the world out there, getting almost as if like an extra layer of fat, getting protected early on might be advantageous. So that's how we understand this paradoxical finding of higher heart rate variability in fetuses when their mothers have higher cortisol during pregnancy.
And so for a mom listening to this who might be either having a stressful pregnancy or know that they did have a stressful pregnancy, what are the kinds of things that a mom can do with baby or can do for baby to help with that stress exposure?
Mm-hmm. I think that the first response to that is for all of us to take a deep breath. And what I mean by that is that it pleases me and my colleagues who are working in this area that we're all starting to pay attention to the prenatal period as a time not just when the baby's gaining weight, but that there's brain development going on and that we are shaping who that baby is going to become. That being said, we have to be very humble and realize that we're at the beginning of understanding these processes, and that surely stress and depression are one of many, many, many exposures that make up the baby's world. So we have to really keep it in perspective. And I would also say that for any woman who is experiencing stress and depression, anxiety during pregnancy, unfortunately, there's still a kind of stigma or shame in general around, struggling in life, and perhaps particularly during the pregnancy postpartum period, when there's this huge assumption that it's a time of only joy, and people tend to idealize it. So that can really inhibit women from getting help they need. So the first thing I would say is take care of yourself, through going to your primary care doctor, seeking out psychotherapy, seeking out groups, support groups. It's so important to take care of yourself. There are many ways to de-stress and manage our mental health nowadays. When there is a baby already born and there's a sense that it was a very stressful pregnancy, for any mother and baby, and again, I realize I'm focusing on mothers, and I know that families are wonderfully varied these days, and often it's a partner or a male partner who's taking the primary care role, but I am focusing on women just because those are the women who've been in my research, and I know best through clinical work. For any parent, I can say this broadly, what goes on in this early period is getting to know the baby, and the baby is getting to know their caregiver. So there's really a dance of getting to know each other and making use of the kinds of different tools that are out there and getting help to get at those tools to help regulate your baby as best as possible is a wonderful thing to do. But all mothers are going to have moments of not knowing how to soothe their baby, and all babies are going to be unsoothable. And that is part of the developmental process. So again, taking a deep breath and seeing this as a period of getting to know your baby as they're getting to know you, so you can be regulating each other as best as possible. Because how the baby is doing in terms of literally whether they're sleeping, and also affects women, mothers, and it also how they're doing affects women's sense of confidence and competence in parenting. I think the other thing to add about this period is that it's an odd metaphor, but we talk about the brain as being incredibly plastic, and there's just phenomenal neuronal proliferation going on in utero and then postnatally, and as well as connections being made between neurons, really up until the age of 3. It's phenomenal growth in that. So the brain is plastic, it's changing, and that's why we have this developmental perspective to remember, even if factors have been non-optimal, being with your baby who they are now and helping regulate them, the brain is ready for that input.
Right, and I think the key point you just made was talking about developmental process, like understanding that it is a process, talking about like the brain's plasticity. It just brings up the whole topic of epigenetics as well, as that it's not just a baby's born and okay, they're set for life, that it is something that can be worked with and worked on, and as you become a better parent and understand your kiddo better, as you were just saying, that it's going to help unwind tension between the two of you and set you up later on in life to have a really strong healthy environment regardless of what came beforehand.
Yeah, that's a really lovely way to say it, unwinding the tension.
Yes.
Really, because I think every parent, even if it's your third baby, feels a certain amount of tension because every baby is different and there's just a lot of demands on you. And the word work is not so appropriate here, but in a sense it is of how are you two going to work together.
Yes.
And to unwind tension and to amplify the positive.
Right. Well, in our last moments here, like where can people learn more about your work? Is there some resources you can point people towards?
Absolutely. So we do have a website, a lab website, which I think is pretty readily findable on Google, which is Perinatal Pathways, or you can do Perinatal Pathways at Columbia. And given the day and age we live, I think that if you also put in my name with my degree, you pretty easily find me and then find the lab and the lab website. And that will have really a range, I look forward to having your interview up there someday. That'll have some other interviews, some other talks I've given, a description of the research studies we're doing, as well as some of our published papers.
Very nice. And so with everything we talked about today, what's the major take-home message you'd like the listeners to take away from today's discussion?
I would hope that people would take away a sense of, again, I'm going to use this word, of development, that really, across the life course, we are developing and we are getting shaped by our environments, and of course shaping our environments. We can choose to be, as we get older, in more optimal or less optimal places for ourselves, but we are shaped by our environments, and that this starts in utero, and that the in-utero period for women, their babies, and potentially the whole family, it's an incredible time to have an optimistic approach and to be bringing in tools and habits to minimize stress, to feel as best as one can, and how to manage the future challenges for both the mother and the baby.
Yeah, I know that as a parent, that it is a process. My son's almost 4, and I always say, like, I would be a really good parent to a 2-year-old, but my kid's not 2 anymore. They're 3. And as I'm getting better at being a parent of a 3-year-old, he's going to have a birthday in a little while, and he's going to be 4. So there is that continual process of trying to just, grow together. He teaches me, I try and teach him, we work together.
Yeah, and I think, and that is absolutely what's going on. And then, of course, when you have a second child, they may be very, very different, which is fascinating. I think part of temperament, some of our data shows, gets constructed in utero. But and then there are genes, and that are, our DNA sequences that have something to do with who we are. And then you get a very different child. So your template for a 2-year-old has to get redone because it's, not like your older child. And it's really important for us to remember this. At the same time of saying it's a process, I am rather conservative as a clinician and a human being, at least in this area, in terms of, but I think we do all need to remember we are the adults, and kids need boundaries and limits, and we do know more. And we can, I think it's having a balance or between both, we are learning each other, and how to parent best this child versus my first, or versus, this is just my first child. And it is learning, and in that sense, there's mutuality, but at the same time, we are the grown-up and these are the rules.
Right.
And I think that's how to balance that. If I could add one more place for your listeners to go in terms of, given an interest in this area, the National Institutes of Health is launching a very large project. It's a year old now, that is really about early factors shaping who children become. And it's called ECHO, ECHO, which stands for Environmental Influences on Children's Health Outcomes. And ultimately, the aim is it will be what we call a cohort of 50,000 children who are studied. So if anyone is interested in this, they can just Google NIH ECHO and learn about the work that's going on. And there's a pretty good possibility that there may be a study in their area. Some of the samples they've already recruited for these studies, but there conceivably could be ways to get involved, and certainly it's going to be a source of information for many years to come.
Well, I'll make sure I'll do that. The NIH search for the ECHO project, and I'll put the link in the show notes along with your Prenatal Pathways Lab, so people don't have to search around. They can just link right to it. And then also, if you're listening on the website, it'll have those links in the post as well. Great. Well, in our last question, what about for the little baby that might be listening in utero with mama getting ready for the birth, or maybe they're here and listening through as mom's listening? What words of wisdom do you have for that little one? So
I'm going to answer in many ways on that. It's such really interesting question. On the one hand, I think we've barely begun to scratch the surface on sensory experiences in utero, such as smell and hearing, and how they influence children's development. So we know that shortly after birth, babies will prefer their mother's breast milk to another woman's breast milk. And that's from the olfactory, the smell cues in utero that are similar to her breast milk. Babies recognize and prefer their mother's voice reading Dr. Seuss to another strange woman. So there is no doubt these sensory experiences are some of the earliest developing parts of the brain. That is who the mother is, and her life is getting into the baby in utero through these sensory experiences. So that being said, I'm sure that's going on, and we haven't scratched the surface, as I say on that. On the other hand, we just have no idea. I mean, and I'm not even sure your question is going here, but just to be clear, I don't think there's any evidence of babies having what we call perception or ideation at this time. But that being said, I would like to think that there someday in the future, babies might, when they're older, listen to your podcast. And how we all, I think, become healthier human beings is when we ultimately have a capacity to reflect on who we are and who our parents were when they were parenting us. So, for example, we can certainly go through periods of being very affected by a mother who's unavailable because she's depressed and out of work. And as growing up, and maybe that starts in utero, my data suggests it does, being affected by it, and then growing up, it's the experience of an unavailable mother. So maybe someday that sort of person would listen to your podcast and have the ability to reflect and see and have a sense of, doesn't mean my mother didn't love me or wasn't trying to do the best by me during pregnancy, but she was really out of resources and struggling herself.
Yes.
So I hope there can be a shift in perspective, and that your podcast can help bring in an added view.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate everything that you've shared here. I'll have those links, as I said, for you listeners to make sure that you can learn more about it. And Dr. Monk, I understand you're going to be a keynote speaker at the APA conference here in San Diego in a couple months. I'll be there, so hopefully we connect then.
Great. I look forward to that, and thank you very much.
Hi, it's Dr. J again, and I want to thank you so much for listening to the podcast. It's something I really enjoy doing, and I, as a parent, learn a ton from these experts coming on and sharing their wisdom, so I hope you're getting a lot out of it too. And I want to share something else with you. I've created a guide called the 40 Ways to Connect with Your Baby During Pregnancy. It's full of simple things you can do on a day-to-day basis that will help strengthen that bond that you have with your baby. It's a free download. You can go to my website at drjwarren.com/40ways and just enter your email. I'll send it right to you. You can download it and start working on it right away. All of the research that I'm learning in the fields of epigenetics and attachment parenting is showing that the more bonded you are during your pregnancy with your baby, the better the birth is going to go and the better parenting is going to go, because you have that strong foundation, a strong connection to build upon. So go again to my website. It's drjwarren.com/40ways and get that free guide. And again, thanks for listening.